Welcome to Spread the Light, where we use the power of our stories of living with mental illness to help dispel stigma and stereotypes, and instead spread hope and light. I'm your host, Dr. Devika Bhushan. I'm a pediatrician, a public health practitioner, an immigrant to the US from India by way of the Philippines, a parent, and a person with bipolar disorder. Today, I'm really happy to welcome to the show Dr. Ahmed Hankir. He is the lead for public engagement and education at the World Health Organization, Collaborating Center for Mental Health and Human Rights, Institute of Mental Health, Nottingham University in the UK. Dr. Hankir is passionate about empowering and dignifying people living with mental health conditions. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and for having me. I'm thrilled.
Great to have you here. And we'll just go ahead and jump right in. You've talked a lot about leaving Lebanon when you were 17, and I'm wondering if you can tell us more about that and also about how your mental health journey began.
When I left my parents behind me in Lebanon, I'll never forget the date, the 10th of July 2000. And I must say that many people who do migrate or who do seek sanctuary or who do seek refuge don't do so because they want to, but because they have no other choice. And certainly that felt like it was the case for me. And so that specific date, 10th of July 2000, Beirut International Airport. And my parents were there. My mother was crying inconsolably. And I always say this, there's no heart like a mother's heart, and there's no mother's heart like my mother's heart. And I'm sure she's still processing the trauma to this day. And my father was there, looking very serious and somber. But it just felt like I had no other choice. The situation back then over there was terrible. I think, more than 60, 70% of the population, if I'm not mistaken, was living below the poverty line, and prospects were not looking too good. So packed my bags and I arrived in England, and I was 17 years old. My mind was still maturing. My brain was still developing. My heart was still growing. I was naive, I think, quite clueless. Thought that money grows in trees. I thought that we would just waltz into medical school. It was always my dream to become a doctor. I graduated top of the class. And I thought we would be kind of welcomed with arms wide open and they would embrace us. But the reality was very different. My qualifications from Lebanon were not recognized. And I had to survive. And what I mean by that is I was independent. I was completely reliant on the money that I would make from working. And so I had to find a job fast. And my first job actually was in this place in the Midlands in England. And I was working in a van selling burgers and kebabs with a refugee, an asylum seeker from Chechnya. 17 years old. And that was when I witnessed my first homicide.
Oh,
wow. Welcome to the UK. I think a bunch of younger men, intoxicated, I think. And I witnessed them kick someone in the head to death.
Oh my goodness.
And it was very, very traumatic. And then moved from the Midlands to a city called Leeds, which is in the north of England. Bigger city, we thought perhaps more diverse. And as I said, my qualifications were not recognized. So I was considered unskilled. And we have this, I don't know if you know him, his name is Nigel Farage. He's very close friends with Donald Trump. And he's on the right of the political spectrum, pro-Brexit, anti-immigration. Right. And, he would say things like, for example, immigrants are only welcome to the UK if you're skilled.
Familiar playbook.
So I was an unskilled immigrant. So you're not welcome here. And so, my first job was working in this van selling burgers and kebabs. But my first full-time job was working in a supermarket. I think the equivalent of Walmart or something, like stacking shelves. And I was also a janitor in the mornings. I had two jobs because, we're trying to make ends meet, right? On minimum wage, right? So that was my reality. And I can't deny it. I felt melancholic. You have kind of these I thought we're coming to England, like I said, I'll just walk into medical school, but that was not the
Right.
reality. And I just felt like, despite my best efforts to integrate, we were socially
Mhm.
excluded. I don't know if that's because of my ethnicity. I suspect race has a role. My faith, I'm a practicing Muslim, and Islamophobia is a growing problem.
Absolutely.
I don't drink alcohol, so you can't really socialize. Um, well, it seems like you can't really socialize. You can't really be
Mm.
accepted. Alcohol plays such a big
Right.
part in British
Pub
culture.
culture is huge.
Uh,
Absolutely. I mean, I think maybe today it's a little bit easier with the fact that we have non-alcoholic beers and things like that, but absolutely,
yeah,
it's hard.
it was
Yeah.
challenging, and like I did feel like I was socially excluded, and
Mhm.
yeah. So these are all kind of the factors that contributed to, I guess, feeling melancholic. And I was far removed from my family, and it was tough. It was really tough having to work 60, 70, 80 hours a week on minimum wage, stacking shelves, calluses on my
Mm.
hands, evidence of the manual labor, cleaning floors, and not really getting that kind of appreciation from society.
Mm.
I was about to say not being respected, but not even being recognized.
Right.
It's like you are non-existent. Like, I'd say good morning to people,
Mm.
being the kind of extrovert, gregarious person that I
Yeah.
was. And people wouldn't say good morning back to me.
Oh my.
I didn't understand that. Why is that?
Mm.
I was talking to my twin brother about this, and we were talking about how ethnics, if you are extrovert, you are eviscerated.
Mm.
Like an extrovert ethnic is eviscerated. You're supposed to be like in the background and conform, and
Mhm.
that's what I felt like at times. Yeah,
Mm.
but no, very challenging, and like I said, felt melancholic. But my faith was a protective factor. It continues to be a protective factor.
Mhm.
I would derive a lot of solace from my faith, from my prayers, going to the local mosque, for example. All of these things helped. So then the following year, and also I was fully aware that I had been given a decent shot at life, to quote Barack Obama. I had this golden opportunity. Here in the UK, education is a birthright, and arguably we have some of the best universities in the world. If you look at the World University rankings or whatever, although I would argue university is what you make out of it, so it doesn't matter which university you go to. But yeah, so I was fully aware. I just had to stay focused.
Mhm.
And then the following year, I enrolled into what we call a sixth form, which I think is like equivalent to pre-med in the US, because you had to do your A levels. So I did A levels, and I was still working full time. And you're in college or whatever, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And then on a Saturday, you get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and you're waiting for the bus. And it's, what the weather's like in the UK. It's
Mhm.
cold, it's dark, it's wet.
Mhm.
And sometimes you miss that bus. So you have to wait another hour until the bus comes because you can't afford to pay for a taxi. And then you go and you have these kind of empty fridges in the supermarket, and it's cold. You have to fill those fridges with milk and whatever.
Mhm.
And you're doing that for 14 hours. And there's no shame in this. I'm not saying there's any shame. If anything, we would discharge our duties honorably.
Mhm.
But the point is, I left my family behind me, and because my dream was to become a doctor, and it just felt like it was so far away,
Yeah.
realizing that dream. But yeah, I mean, I continued to work full-time hours, and then I would go to college. And the head of the sixth form asked us what we want to do with our lives, and I'll never forget this. She laughed in our faces when we said to her that it was our dream to become a doctor. She laughed in our faces,
Mm.
said it's too competitive. You'll never get into medical school.
Mm.
But we didn't allow her to diminish our determination and our resolve. So I continued to work full time. And this posed a constant threat to securing the grades that were necessary
Mm.
to get into medical school.
Right.
And I think it was that fear. It was just that fear. I would be damned. Excuse my
Mm.
language. I would admonish myself,
Mhm.
rather. Here I have this opportunity, right? And I would admonish myself of somebody who didn't, I guess, work as hard as me, got into medical school, and I didn't. And I think that was what helped to drive me at the time. And sure enough, I secured straight A grades, and I matriculated into Manchester Medical School. So that's some background information. 2006, when I was in my third year, I woke up one morning to discover that my hometown in Lebanon was bombed. This
Mm.
was the Lebanon War. And I felt really passionate at the time. I was deeply sensitized to the events that were unfolding.
Mm.
And I felt so passionate about social justice,
Right.
and I just witnessed injustice on such a huge scale. Like, what is going on? You can just drop these bombs and kill hundreds of people and destroy all the infrastructure and all these homes. These are homes. These are not just houses. These are
Mm.
homes. That was one of the factors. There were also some difficulties in the UK. I remember falling out with people who I thought at the time were my closest companions. And so that was another factor that contributed. I got to this kind of breaking point. I once referred to it as a breakdown, but it's more like a breakthrough. And yeah, I reacted. I mean, you just witness the front page headlines, war in Lebanon, your family is there. Maybe I was catastrophizing. Maybe I thought, oh my God, because I couldn't get through to
Oh
my
my
family. Oh
God.
my God,
I can't imagine
that
how
was my
scary that
reality.
was. Yeah.
Yeah, it really was. I was kind of highly aroused at the
Mhm.
time. And like I said, maybe I was catastrophizing, but for me, it was
How could
real.
you
That's what
not
it felt like.
catastrophize in that situation?
Well, I mean, it's a
It
catastrophe,
is.
isn't it?
Yeah.
It's catastrophic, right? How can you catastrophize a catastrophe, right?
Right.
But that's interesting because, the term a colleague of mine uses, Dr. Tariq Yunus, is psychologize. It's all in your mind.
Mm.
It's not your reality. So there's no such thing as structural and systemic discrimination. It's all in your
Mm.
mind. It's how you react. You psychologize. So we use these kind of language, right?
Right.
So that I guess those who are in power exonerate themselves and feel better about themselves. But I mean, yeah, so I experienced an episode of psychological distress and I was forced to interrupt medical school. And oh my goodness. I mean, the symptoms were
Mhm.
debilitating, but the stigma was far
Mhm.
worse. It was how people would dehumanize you and they would shun you
Mhm.
and stigmatize you. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. And I'll never ever forget that. I mean, it continues to haunt me in a
Mhm.
way, but also shape my values and my outlook and my worldview.
Mm.
And yeah, that's why I've been a stigma warrior or a man on a
Mhm.
mission or, energized to challenge mental health related stigma whenever and wherever we see it. Because I've felt the fire of stigma. And as I said, it was mental health related stigma is
Yeah.
devastating.
Right.
So I eventually sought informal support from the imam,
Mhm.
the faith leader. And then he would urge me to seek professional help, which is what I did from an NHS psychiatrist. I think a lot of the healing actually happened outside of
Mm.
psychiatry. Yeah, it takes time as
Mhm.
well. Sometimes you take one step forward and two steps backwards, but that's
Mm.
okay, right? I mean, you just brush yourself off and you lift yourself up and you do what you
Mhm.
can. But I really want to emphasize that, it
It
takes time.
does. Yeah.
It takes years, People see this, they see a snapshot and so whatever you call it, success but they don't see, all the years of suffering and struggling and hardship and anguish and all of
Mm.
that. But yeah, no, the tools, definitely, yeah. As I said, I did seek professional
Mhm.
help. My faith, exercise, oh my
Mhm.
goodness, modifying your lifestyle, so important. Yeah,
Mhm.
self-care, things like
Mhm.
that. Yeah, I resumed medical school and I can get quite poetic when it's appropriate. There's a fire burning in my belly and a thunder in my heart. And yeah, I was
Mm.
determined. I was really determined. And I qualified and I became a doctor, but my journey had only just begun, because I was humiliated for so long. I was
Mm.
disempowered for so
Mhm.
long. And it felt like redemption in a
Yeah.
way, And so I was, I guess, inspired to work above and beyond the call of duty. And then I pioneered this kind of a movement, if you like, this wounded healer movement. It's a presentation and it signposts my mental health journey, my recovery journey from impoverished man of color with mental health problems to empowered psychiatrist, citizen, human being, survivor, expert by experience. I'm all of those things. And yeah, that's the wounded healer. It blends the power of the performing arts and storytelling with psychiatry. And what I mean by that is, as I said, I signpost my mental health journey. And I provided insights into what I call drama therapy. And so, I would reenact scenes from films, or I would harness the power of spoken word
Mm,
poetry and try to demonstrate how the vehicle of the humanities can contribute to mental health recovery and resilience. And initially, I took some time out of, I think the term you use in the US is
mhm,
residency. I took 2 years out. And because stigma activities are stigmatized themselves, I didn't get any funding.
mm,
If I said, "Oh, I've got this brilliant idea for this new mood stabilizer," I'm sure pharmaceutical companies would be very enthusiastic to finance me. But yeah, all of this was self-funded.
mm, mhm,
So I would literally reach out to each medical school in the UK has a psychiatry society. We call them psych
mhm.
socs. So this is like a bottom-up approach to challenging stigma. And then, for example, top-down approaches, I would contact the Royal College of Psychiatrists or the American Psychiatric Association or the counterpart in Australia, for
Right.
example. And so, yeah, I was delivering the Wounded Healer in person
Wow.
to all of the medical schools in the UK. I must have delivered it in person to over 100,000
Oh my
people.
goodness.
But yeah, it took a long time. It's been about 10 years now. I've been to the West Coast
Mm,
and hopefully be there next week.
right,
So,
right. We'll get to
yeah,
hang
yeah,
out in
excited.
person.
These experiences can be
Right.
intense, and we want to give you an insight into what it's
Mm,
like. And I think all healthcare professionals should know what
yeah.
it's like, the subjective experience, if you want to be more empathetic, because I think empathy is a prerequisite for
Right,
healing, right?
right. Let me ask you this too. You've so beautifully laid out for us the different pieces of what led to your breaking point, as you call it, and then what it took to heal from that. Can you
Yeah,
share
yeah.
the formal diagnoses that you received during that journey?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I can share the diagnoses I've received, but I personally find using descriptors
More,
more
yeah,
helpful.
fair enough.
Yeah. So, people have said that you've got major depressive disorder. People will say that you've got bipolar affective disorder. People might say that you have schizoaffective disorder. All of those things. I don't find labels very
Mm,
helpful. I can say for sure, as I said, I felt
yeah,
melancholic.
right.
I felt elated. I felt exuberant. But Kate,
Of
Professor
course.
Jamison, the author of An Unquiet
Yes.
Mind, right? And she is honest and open about her experiences living with bipolar affective disorder. I'll never forget what she said. She said, "Where do we go if we want to learn more about the human condition or about our emotions?" And then I'll never forget this. Her face contorted when she goes, "Do we go to psychiatry? Definitely not. Don't go to psychiatry." Because what are they going to do? Are they going to psychopathologize the expression of human emotion? Then she said, we go to theology. I thought that was really interesting
Mhm,
because, yeah, does theology capture the pathos and the rage and the
mhm,
despair
mhm,
that we can experience, the spectrum of human emotion, and not necessarily psychopathologize? Yes, that
mhm,
resonated with me. But yeah, just to kind of summarize the psychiatric diagnoses I've received, or the labels, if you like: major depressive disorder, bipolar affective disorder, schizoaffective disorder. I don't really identify with
I
those
see.
labels, and I think people tend to be more
Mhm,
inquisitive when we use
mhm.
descriptors. So
Yeah, and it
yeah,
helps people who haven't experienced that themselves really understand what it feels like, more so than a descriptor. The descriptors come with their own set of problems and very loaded stereotypes.
yeah,
They
they
do.
do, yeah,
They're limiting in a lot of ways because, again, for instance, I have bipolar disorder, right? And I do
yeah,
identify with that descriptor, but at the same time, now having met hundreds of people who identify with the same descriptor, I know how different people's experiences can be even within that. And,
mm,
depending on who you are and where you've come from and the kinds of symptoms you've had at the points at which you've had them developmentally and sort of contextually what was going on for you then. I mean, it's just a very, diverse set of experiences within that one umbrella term. So sometimes it's useful to clump and, organize your experiences using a word or a term like that. But other times it can
yeah.
almost fracture people.
I think so. I think so. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you took the words out of my mouth,
Mhm,
so
mhm.
I'm in full agreement with you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing those terms just for what they're worth and for also sharing your dubiousness about them. And I share that and I hear it. And I think folks who are listening will also resonate with that. So, looking back, like the pinnacle of that breaking point or any other part of your journey where things were really hard, what's one thing you
Mm.
could go back and tell yourself, knowing what you know now, that you think would have made it easier?
It's interesting because when I think of rock bottom, I think of the insight switch turning
Mm,
on. And what I mean by that is because you're in denial
yeah.
for so long, right? By definition, you're lacking that kind of self awareness. And then it can happen so suddenly that insight switch just
Mm,
turns on and you behold the conflagration in your
mhm,
wake. And I would say, the bridges in Lebanon were burning quite
mhm,
literally. And I'm burning bridges in the metaphorical sense with people who I thought, like I said, were my closest companions at the time and my family members. And it's almost like you're kind of oblivious to
mm,
it. And then you snap out of it. And I'll never forget that moment. I was in this kind of dilapidated, squalid, what we call terrace house in one of the roughest neighborhoods in Manchester where, gun crime was rife. And I'm like, what the hell happened? How did I end up
mm,
here? When I was forced to interrupt medical school and like all that hard work down the drain. I mean, I told you what I had to do to get into medical school and it was taken
mm,
away from me. And this will shatter my masculine bravado, but I don't care if it does. We need to challenge toxic masculinity, especially in communities of color and men of color. There's that kind of
yeah.
bravado, isn't there? And I was crying
Mm,
inconsolably. It was so overwhelming, the realization, all the kind of damage that was done, seemingly
mm,
beyond repair, and how
mm,
isolated I was, and how disconnected I was. And oh my goodness, I think news started to spread like wildfire. Did you hear about what happened to Ahmed?
mm,
And like, yeah, all part of the
mm,
stigma, right? That hurt. It hurt. I was invited recently to give a talk in Hartford, and I met some of the recovery support specialists, people living with a mental health condition, and they commented on how they could relate to the pain I was referring to. It's these psychological wounds that cause so much
mhm,
pain as well. And you wish that there was something that could get rid of the pain. Like you just want to snap your fingers, right? You want that pain to go, but it doesn't work
right.
that way, right? And it's the patience, isn't it? And I mean, it's no wonder, for example, let's talk about suicide in people living with bipolar affective disorder. The highest rates of suicide are in people living with bipolar affective disorder. Is it any surprise? We talk about this pain, which can be so
Mhm,
overwhelming. And if I might feel like that's the only way out, trying to resist that seductive
mhm,
impulse of ending your life isn't easy. It takes time. Yeah. I mean, I can't emphasize it enough. It takes time. Yeah. I guess my faith, I keep on going back to my faith because in Islam, suicide is
mm,
forbidden. So that
mm,
deterred me. What else? Just processing what happened. Maybe therapy can help with that if you can afford it. But unfortunately, we have these huge waiting lists, and there's a treatment gap. The means can't meet the
right.
demand. I think now with the advent of the digital age, there's a lot of content out there from trauma influencers, Gabor Mate, for example, who I think is based in Vancouver. I was able to relate to a lot of the content that was
Yeah.
being posted. I mean, obviously, there is a caveat because some of these people are not what we call mental health care
Mhm,
professionals, but there's a shared experience. So they can be considered experts by
right.
personal experience. For example, they would talk about
Mhm,
the shame. And you're like, well, yeah, I can
mhm,
relate to that. And that can be
yeah,
cathartic, can't it? You're like, yeah, I can relate to because they're validating what you're
right.
feeling. When somebody makes you feel like your experiences are not real, right? Or just pull yourself together. Or other people have
Yeah.
a lot worse. Why are you
Mm,
complaining? You should be grateful. You live in London. There are people living in wherever, Beirut or Damascus or Ukraine now or whatever. You shouldn't be
mm,
complaining. That kind of
mhm,
invalidation.
mhm,
So it's a process. You take it one day at a time. Stay active. Oh my goodness. I can't emphasize that enough. Many people say that
yeah,
medication is life saving. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm
right.
a medical doctor. I don't dispute that. The drugs didn't
Mm,
work for me. The psychiatric prescribed psychotropic medication didn't work for me. The adverse effects were
Mm-hmm.
intolerable, unbearable. And we can't turn a
Right.
blind eye to that.
Right.
A lot of people talk about, prescribed harm, right? Iatrogenic, I think there's somebody who actually has a Twitter handle called "Damaged by Benzos." I think,
It's real.
this
It's
is
real.
serious. This is real. This is real. So on the one hand, you have people saying medications are life saving. On the other hand, people are saying no, they destroyed my life. So it's what's right for you as an individual, and it's making that informed choice. And being clear that there are adverse effects which can be unbearable, intolerable.
Right.
But there are people saying that, wait a second, these medications can be life-saving and have improved the quality of my life. So it's what's right for you as an individual. You're asking me at the pinnacle of my breaking point? No, medication did not help personally for me. But that doesn't mean it
That's
doesn't help other
fair.
people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious,
I'm being honest.
yeah, as a
Yeah.
psychiatrist, what is your approach and how is it informed by your journey?
It's interesting how it's informed by my journey. So let's say, 2:00 in the morning, I'm in the emergency department in central London or South London. I've been asked to see a patient, assess a patient, provide care to a patient in a mental health crisis. And more often than not, I draw on my kind of personal expertise than I do my professional expertise. I kind of try to go down on their level. I think we need more humility in medicine. I think maybe a lot of medical doctors like to place themselves on a pedestal. I don't think that's helpful. We need to be more humble and try to have that kind of authentic connection and listen. It's so important. It's so powerful, this tool to listen, and the nonverbal communication and the validation and the empathy and listening with an open mind and an open heart and giving people that sanctuary that they need. They want to feel safe. Don't judge me. I just want you to listen to me and to validate my experiences. And I try to do that as best as I can. I'm careful not to impose my experiences. Just because I live with a mental health condition, it doesn't mean that the person receiving care from me has been through similar experiences or I've been through similar experiences to them. So it's unique, isn't it? It's subjective. And I seldom ever share in a clinical context that I live with a mental health condition. I do a lot more listening than I do talking. I think that was the take-home message in a clinical context, just the power of empathic listening and how therapeutic and dignifying and empowering that can be.
Yes, absolutely. Speaking both as a patient and a pediatrician, absolutely. So, looking back at your journey so far, what are you proudest of?
Oh my goodness. I remember last year when I got an email from the World Health Organization informing me that the Director General, Dr. Tedros, he selects 6 people every year, across the world, to receive the Director General Award for Global Health. And Paul Farmer, may he rest in peace. So he was one of them.
Right.
Unsurprisingly, Professor Paul Farmer, his contributions to global health are unparalleled. And I was one of the 6 people. Couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. Oh my goodness. Amazing. So there I was in Geneva at the World Health Assembly, and all the world leaders were there. Presidents, prime ministers, health ministers. This is actually a big deal for Lebanon as well. I remember this was all over the media in Lebanon. We're still recovering from the largest non-nuclear explosion in history in Beirut. It was a few years ago. And the economy has collapsed and we've been crippled by corruption. And I think this gave hope to the people of Lebanon. It was all over the news. And, that was a very proud moment for me. I got to meet him, Dr. Tedros himself. He embraced in front of everyone. I got a standing ovation. I referred to my father, the people's doctor. He works in Lebanon and provides healthcare to the Palestine and the Syrian refugees free of charge. And that's when everyone, all the world leaders, they all started clapping and gave him a round of applause.
How moving.
It was very proud. I couldn't hold back the tears. Well, I also am proud of my community. The community at the moment I have on Twitter. We connected.
That's how we connected.
and it's an
Yeah,
authentic connection. Yeah, yeah. I'm immensely
me
grateful for
too.
that, to connect with like-minded, like-hearted people like you, champions, advocates, humanists. That community is a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. It can be an unforgiving place.
Definitely.
There are unfortunately trolls. It's important that we are not oblivious to that, because you need to protect yourself. These trolls and some of the most vitriolic comments have come from fellow mental health care professionals, from psychiatrists, would you
Wow.
believe it? The profession that's been charged to protect our mental health have made the most
Mm,
harmful comments. But the positivity and the love far outweighs the
I'm
negativity.
glad to hear that. So what is one mental health myth that you'd like to bust for us?
That having a mental health condition is something to be ashamed about, that we are doomed to underachievement, and that we'll never recover, and that we'll never
Mm,
succeed, or that we'll never
mm,
function, or that we'll never realize our dreams. I mean, there are so many myths that abound. But I mean, yeah, it's nothing to be ashamed about. And recovery is a reality for the many and not for
mhm,
the few. I don't think we're doing enough for people with severe mental illness. And I don't want to misinform you. I can't sit down here and say everyone with a mental health condition will
mhm,
recover and will function again. No, that's not the reality. And my heart goes out to those living with a severe mental illness who have been
mhm.
let down because, we don't have enough resources, or there's not enough support out there. And that's, in the words of John Steinbeck, a sorrow that weeping cannot symbolize. But with the right support, to emphasize, recovery is a reality for the many and not for the few. And it really can't emphasize enough that it's nothing to be
Mm.
ashamed about. I mean, I think it's helpful when I refer to it as my superpower.
Yes.
It is my
Yes.
superpower. It makes me more empathetic. It makes me more insightful. It makes me more driven. I spoke about having this fire burning in my belly and thunder in my heart to make important and meaningful and positive contributions, not only to our communities, but to our world.
Absolutely. That was actually gonna be my very next question, how you see your mental health journey as having molded your unique superpowers. You did the answer to that beautifully. And so a practical question to ask you next, which is when you've said that the majority can have access to recovery, which I think is such a beautiful and empowering thought. And for you personally, as you have lived your life, you've spoken about some of the ways in which you stay well, including exercise, your faith, therapy, potentially in moments where that's been useful.
Yeah. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. Yeah. Go on.
And so when you feel yourself sort of backsliding or having moments where you're starting to feel burned out or starting to feel symptomatic or more melancholic or more elated, how do you deal in those moments? What do you do?
Yeah. The words we use, I guess, in psychiatry, early warning signs or relapse
Yeah,
indicators.
exactly.
I know I'm repeating myself, but staying active, go for a walk. Oh my God. Sometimes you can be so preoccupied, is the right word? Maybe with the inner turmoil, like what's happening inside your
Mhm,
mind. And that's where your focus
mhm.
is. And then when you immerse yourself in nature and when you focus on your environment and you see the beauty in this world, and that can distract you from the inner turmoil. And it can be as simple as that. I mean, don't get me wrong. If you're depressed, it can be a monumental achievement just getting out of bed.
Yes.
And when you do, and you just go to your local park or your local lake, yeah, instead of kind of looking inward and, this turmoil and clutter. And that's the thing, you get to declutter your
Yeah,
mind.
yeah, absolutely.
I feel like, you've emancipated the inner
Mhm,
child in me. But, oh my God, just thinking about it, just cycling or going for a walk, or I love to
yeah.
run. But then also, I remember like these kind of open mic
Mhm,
events. You get to expound, you get to express yourself. And that's what I, refer to as drama therapy. Watching a
mhm,
film, there's something called cinema
mhm,
therapy. It's not the first
mhm,
line, but certainly as an
mhm.
adjunct. You know, maybe you can identify with the protagonist, and that identification can be comforting. Oh my goodness, it could be the protagonist in a novel, then maybe a protagonist of the film. Actually, there was this astonishing study that was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry on brief video interventions to reduce the stigma attached to first episode
Mm,
psychosis, which is one of the most stigmatized
absolutely.
conditions, right? It was a brief video intervention, and there were sustained reductions in stigma. It was in 90
Mm,
seconds. 90 seconds is all it took. And the protagonist was an African
mhm,
American woman living with
mm,
schizophrenia. And what are the ingredients? You are able to identify with the protagonist, especially if you're a lady of
mm.
color, because we've all experienced emotional turmoil. So you can identify with the emotional turmoil that she's experienced. So there was that identification. Two, she was humanizing people living with mental health conditions because people living with mental health conditions are being
Right,
dehumanized. She was humanizing us because we are human beings.
right,
We are law abiding, community serving, peace loving people. And the third one was emotional engagement. You've got to be able to engage the mind
right.
and the heart. And so this brief video intervention, 90 seconds is all it takes. You identify with the protagonist, and that can be cathartic.
Amazing, amazing. This sounds really moving and powerful and important. So, last question to round us out. What are your hopes for our future collectively?
Yeah, hopes and dreams. In The Wounded Healer, I quote Edgar Allan Poe: I'm dreaming dreams that no mortal ever dared to dream before. From
Mm,
The Raven. A vision, peaceful coexistence, that we can be more caring and kind to one another. How do we do that? By harnessing, by spreading the light, right?
absolutely.
The world can be a dark and lonely place. You know this, Devika. But I think when we connect like we are connecting now, and when we have these authentic connections, and when we embrace vulnerability, and when we share our stories, we can spread the light by sharing
Mhm.
our stories. And I think it's so important to plant the seeds of hope into the hearts, minds, bodies, and souls of people living with mental health conditions and psychosocial disabilities. So if we can disseminate this message of hope and recovery and spread the light to as many people as possible, I think that's why there is so much promise with the digital age. You're in San Francisco. Here I am in London. You were in London 10 years ago,
Right.
you said. I don't know if you remember if you were on the Underground or you probably have a
Yeah,
metro there
yeah,
in San Fran, right? And you'd be sat next to somebody, you could feel like you're 1,000 miles away
right.
from them. But then you can be 1,000 miles away from someone and feel like you're
That's
sat
so
next to
true.
them. That's the power of technology or
Right.
connection. And if we harness the power of storytelling, we can have authentic connections. And if we have authentic connections, then we can spread the light and we can
I
spread
love
love.
that. That's a beautiful note on which to close. Thank you so much, Ahmed, for helping us spread the light in so many different ways in the work that you do and the person that you are. Thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.